Infiltration and exfiltration operations. These are also commonly called insertion and extraction tactical methods. We discuss them a great deal both here on this channel as well as in my books and of course at One Shepherd. It's time that we jump deeper into these operations and give more of a concrete description that you can use in conducting both infiltrations and exfiltrations. Let's define the terms first. An infiltration involves a penetration of enemy lines by means of a bypass in order to prepare an enemy target for destruction by follow-on forces. It sounds a little weird, but we are definitely penetrating the enemy's lines. Whether that's a shallow penetration, think like World War I raids or follow-on attacks, just prepping like literally cutting lines through barbed wire so that the follow-on attack doesn't have to deal with that in the face of machine guns and autocannon. Barbed wire slows the friendly forces up, and of course this is what was so incredibly deadly in World War I. And so the way they learned to deal with this was quite literally infiltration tactics. And again, here what they would do is they would send squads ahead of the battalion or even full regiment. And what those multiple squads, what they were doing is they were given tasks to, okay, you infiltrate in tonight and spend all night long cutting holes and paving through the minefields and the barbed wire and everything else. Mark this, just like engineers would do in later years, mark these ways so that we can see it and hone in on that and exploit those in the following morning. So these were early forms of infiltration tactics, and they still follow those same premises, although today the infiltration may go much, much deeper into enemy lines. Yes, a few hundred meters deeper, or miles and miles and miles deeper into enemy lines. And at the heart of every single infiltration, you are bypassing enemy combat power. You're bypassing their strong points in order to mark either that strong point or other targets, enemy targets, for reduction, suppression, and destruction by follow-on enemy forces. And again, follow-on forces can be, large foot formations, regimental attacks. Of course, they can also be other sorts of combined arms attacks involving armor and artillery. They could be close air support or even bombing missions or a wide variety of things that can be brought to bear. So don't just think, oh, it's got to be followed on by an infantry attack. No, you might actually be marking things for artillery or close air support bombing missions. But that's the point. That's why we infiltrate. So then what's an exfiltration? Exfiltration involves the removal of friendly forces from behind enemy lines. Now we do this in order to relocate those friendly forces into an area that is controlled by friendly forces. That is, we are trying to pick up our patrol that infiltrated deep into the enemy's lines, and we're trying to pull them back into our friendly lines. Now, this may be done under pressure. That is, the enemy may very well know of this extraction and may be shooting at us while we try to extract. So it may be done under pressure, or it may be done completely unbeknownst to the enemy forces. And that's, of course, how we prefer to do it. That's it in a nutshell. We went through definitions. Again, infiltration is done through means of bypassing enemy strong points. I don't want to engage with the enemy. I want to bypass them and then mark these, prepare these targets in some way for follow-on attack. The exfiltration then is the means by which we then recover that patrol that infiltrated and bring them back within the safety of our friendly forces. What's critical here is the concept of elusiveness. Now, we've talked about this in past videos. Elusiveness means that our patrol, our assets, and think of in terms of the infiltrating team, we retain maneuver and surprise. Elusiveness allows us to retain maneuver so that we're not decisively engaged. Again, we want to bypass. So we retain maneuver and we retain some component or some element of surprise. Now, again, as we've discussed in previous videos, surprise does not necessarily mean, gotcha, peekaboo, that sort of thing. Surprise is a weird sort of thing because it can be that the enemy sees you. Oh, they're coming from that direction. And they see you for plenty of time. I have no plan. I have no ability and not enough time to coordinate an effective response to that. Think of something like a vertical envelopment where you watch, 180 helicopters fly in, to your rear area, land, and you think, wow, they just dropped a regiment off to my rear. And although I've watched this for 20 minutes, it will take me 12 hours to effect a response, and I will be engaging with them probably in the next hour. So I haven't enough time. That is also surprise. It means that you're not leaving the enemy enough time and space to effect a response. That's what surprise means. Maneuver is a little more simple, and that is that maneuver means that I am not decisively engaged. I can still, even if I'm fighting the enemy, I can break away. Preferably, I'm not fighting them at all, but even if I am exchanging shots with them, so what? I can break away and maneuver to a new advantage point, or completely leave the area, withdraw, bypass, something like this. So that's elusiveness. And you say, well, what are the two ways of gaining and maintaining elusiveness? So that's really what it comes down to with the infiltration and exfiltration. There are two ways to do this. One is stealth. Stealth allows us to be elusive. That is, we retain surprise, we retain maneuver. Stealth is slow. Think of it as a foot patrol because it almost invariably is a foot patrol, but there are exceptions. And our foot patrol must remain hidden from audio detection, visual detection, thermal detection, and electronic signature detection. We don't want to be heard. We don't want to be seen. And of course, movement is the most common thing that is seen to a human eye. But we don't want to be heard. We don't want to be seen. This is noise and light discipline, and it's very slow movement. That's stealth. We need to protect ourselves from thermal detection. Okay, that's going to be many different things, but vegetation masking, terrain masking on our movement, that's one thing. Can we use specialized cloths and materials to also offer thermal defeat? Yes, absolutely. And then lastly is, again, we don't want our electronic signature detection. And this is many different things. It's cell phones and radios, anything that can broadcast. You want to decrease the amount of electronics that you carry on you that broadcast any kind of signature, because those can be detected. And so this is radio communication silence and all that sort of discipline, signal discipline. So that's how we maintain elusiveness through stealth. And then how do you maintain elusiveness through speed? Remember that some insertion and most often the extraction is going to be by vehicle. That is, it's going to be by a land-based vehicle or a water-based vehicle or an airborne vehicle. And so that violates all of it. I can hear you coming, I can see you coming, there's a thermal signature, there's often an electronic signature, and so I can see you. So how is that stealthy? Well, it's not, but it is fast. And the less you can see of me and detect that, and the faster I can be, as I said earlier, too late. You don't have time to respond. You watch a bunch of paratroopers jump into, oh my gosh, a field 10 kilometers away, and you're like, by the time I even get there, they'll be gone. And what's their target? I don't know. This speed is elusiveness. And I'll go you one farther. When you mix that speed with false insertions, you really start to play the nutshell game, where you take the bowls and you're like, okay, where's the penny? And you do that whole mixing up with your hands. Well, that's kind of an analogous way of saying false insertions. So I could say this so many different ways. The 101st Air Assault is really, really good about this. They know their helicopters can be heard even if they can't be seen in broad daylight, because they're doing what's called a nap of the earth, NOE. And that means they're flying at treetop levels with the terrain, so unless they just fly right over you, you can hear them, but you can't see them. So what you learn to do, well, I can hear you, but I can't see you, but I can listen carefully. You can follow with your ears and go, oh, they just stopped over there somewhere, a couple of few kilometers that direction with my compass. Now I know where they let the enemy off, right? Or did they? Because in the 101st, they would generally at least 3 insertion points. And so the enemy doesn't know which. Was it that one 2 kilometers away? Was it that one about 5 kilometers away? Or was it that one about 4 kilometers away? I don't know which one they actually dropped the soldiers off. Was it a little bit of each? Was it just one? We don't know. And so that's called a false insertion. And if you think only helicopters do this, I've been in mechanized units where we were using armored vehicles along the enemy's front line at night, using terrain masking so they couldn't hit us with rockets. And you could hear the grind of the gears and the, and the track and all this stuff. And then it come to a stop. And then you're like, okay, that's where they're inserting. Except we did it again a kilometer later, and then 500 meters later, and then a kilometer later, and then 500 meters later. And you do that all along the enemy's front. And they don't know which one was the insertion or if all of them were insertions. How many vehicles was that? I mean, it wasn't 12, but was it 1 or was it 2 or 3? So you can really mask using terrain masking and a little battlefield deception. That's essentially what false insertions are. So when speed, a vehicle, is mixed with false insertions, this further frustrates and confuses the enemy as to our true location and our intent. So speed is one form of elusiveness, and stealth is one form of elusiveness. We've talked about the definition and the purpose of these two. We have also discussed the critical element of elusiveness with both infiltration and exfiltration. And now let's jump into just the bare bones of how you would go about planning and conducting infiltration, and how you would go about planning and conducting an exfiltration. For infiltration planning, I've got a 10-step process. I'm going to read a little bit from it, and we'll talk that through and then take it to the whiteboard, okay? Infiltration planning. The very first thing you need to ask, of course, is what is the mission? What's your purpose? What's your end state? What's your key tasks? And if you just heard, oh wait, that's commander's intent, you're right. When you say, what's the mission? I want to know a mission statement, and then I need to hear what the commander intends for this mission. A mission statement might sound like, well, we're going to infiltrate to grab an enemy prisoner of war. We're going to infiltrate to cut barbed wire in the enemy's front line for a follow-on attack. We're going to infiltrate so that you can mark the enemy targets deep in the enemy's rear area for attack by close air support. I mean, this just keeps going. So what's the mission and what's the commander's intent is your first question. The second step then in this planning and conduct of an infiltration is reconnaissance and intelligence. That is that you need to hear the latest, greatest intelligence of the enemy, particularly the target, but also the enemy that you're going to infiltrate through. So what's the enemy line doing and what are their assets there, right? There needs to be good reconnaissance. Somebody, I don't care if it was a UAV and satellite feeds, we need some pretty good map intelligence, map reconnaissance here at a bare minimum. Step 3 is you need to identify what your supporting elements are, what friendly supporting units do you have here, and of course the most critical are, do you have vehicles? What's your means of transportation? So how are you inserting and how are you extracting? You think, well, medical evac is a form of extraction. Well, that's just one of many. You really need to look very, very carefully. Far more than beans, batteries, bullets, and band-aids, you need to understand how are we infiltrating and how are we exfiltrating? Like what means is that? And of course, vehicle is the big question here. You may not use a vehicle. Often that is the case, that you don't use a vehicle, but you still need to find that out. So that's step 3 is who's supporting you. Step 4 then is your intelligence preparation of the battle space, your IPB. Your IPB will, of course, be that map, and you have to create maneuver control graphics. This is nothing really surprising, but it does have one caveat. So what you would expect in maneuver control graphics are your phase lines, right? Your line of departure, your SEALs halt, your assembly area, your ORP, your objectives, and all of these things broken down over phase lines. But here's where it gets a little tricky. How much information do you put on your map? Because you are going deep deep or shallow, either way, you're going into the enemy lines. You're definitely infiltrating enemy lines. And so if you're captured or if this map is dropped, you have to have operational security. It can't tell everything. So very commonly I would at least not include the objective. That's one thing to consider. Maybe you don't want to put that into your IPB. I would not include whether it's going to be a hide position or a patrol base. I would not include that. I probably would not include my rendezvous points, and I definitely wouldn't include anything about an extraction plan. So, you know, maybe just phase lines. It might just be a map with phase lines and everything else is kind of understood. You don't want to put too much onto that map, but you definitely need to be able to identify that. Regardless of whether you write it down, that just means everybody needs to memorize it and be able to point to it on a map. Everybody on the patrol. So there you go. You still have them regardless of whether you actually write it on the map overlay or you do not. There's your IPB. Of course, step 5, I'm going to give a step 5. Your route of each subunit is, again, IPB, but this is something I definitely would not include. And especially I wouldn't include it not only because I don't want that to fall into the enemy's hands, but I don't want to include that because it's a little too prescriptive. Each one of those subunits in the infiltration is going to have to find their own way. They're going to have their planned route of infiltration, and then they need to have contingency plans which include alternate routes. Just because the battlefield changes, the battle space changes, Mother Nature gets a vote, the enemy gets a vote. Chance and circumstances, they say. So I include that as step 5, which is the route of each subunit, infiltration route. Step 6, you need to identify the time and or the conditions that we step off from the line of departure. What's your start time? And that is either a time or a specific set of conditions. It could be, you know, I don't know, moonlight. Or, nah, if I'm going to do an infiltration, quite the opposite. I want a new moon. I want pitch blackness, right? So whatever the conditions are, you're going to establish that. You are going to establish that rendezvous point, that's step 7. And we're going to take that again to the board. I'm inclined not to include that on a map overlay, but everybody needs to know it. The rendezvous point almost never will be your patrol base / hide position, whichever one you use. They're both appropriate for different circumstances. But whether I use a hide position or a patrol base, I don't want that on the map, but we need to identify it and we need to move to it. And then our objective, that is the target. We have to have the target, and then of course in this planning process we need to talk about actions on the objective. What are we doing to that target and how, and who's responsible for what? And step 10 then is the exfiltration plan, which we'll get to exfiltration next, but let's take infiltration to the board. All right, here we are. We're up at the whiteboard. What I've got is a fairly nondescript enemy front line. This is their forward line of troops, or the FLOT. We've got enemy over here, enemy infantry, and of course that's a bit of silliness, isn't it? There you go, enemy air defense. So we are going to establish all of our maneuver graphics. We're going to say, okay, this is our infiltration lane over here. Let's say it's over here. That's going to be our infiltration lane. Then we're going to have our line of departure and our phase lines, and you know, pass here and our LOA, limit of advance, our line of departure, which is probably our FLOT, but whatever. And then we're going to have an assembly area, tactical assembly area over here, and we're going to plan out whatever it is. Maybe this is our SEALs halt. I'm going to mark it here for our understanding, but we're going to have our rendezvous, and then we're going to have our objective, which I'm going to say this is our OBJ, our objective over here, that we want to mark the enemy air defense so that our follow-on, you know, whatever, drones or close air support can suppress that. That's called SEADS, Suppression of Enemy Air Defense Systems. And that's our mission. We're going to be part of a SEADS mission. And it is an infiltration and an exfiltration. So this is kind of how it goes. Here's what's critical. Let's say I'm using I love the 14-man patrol, the 14-man squad. So my squad, 14 troops, are tasked to mark this hidden objective out there that they know is somewhere over here. We're going to mark it so that drones can destroy it within the next 36 hours. I'm planning really quick here. We do rehearsals, just as we said. We do an operations orders and rehearsals here in our tactical assembly area. We step off the line of departure when we're told to, or when the conditions are right, and we go over to our SEALs halt. Look, listen, and from the SEALs halt, chances are that's the point that becomes our release point. my guess is from the SEALs halt as a patrol, we say, okay, now we split up. Hold on, what? Oh yeah. There's no way I'm going to try and take 14 guys through this, which I assume my intel will tell me, but this is pretty well defended, pretty well guarded, pretty well monitored. They probably have their own platoon early warning systems out, and I've got all these things to get past. God forbid that I have a village over here with a bunch of barking dogs. Whatever the case is, I've got to get past all of this, right? I think we'd all agree that if I took an 800-man battalion and tried to march us past here, everybody would see us and they'd bring fire on us and we would be engaged. Okay, that's not going to work, so let's not go with 800. What do you think, 120-man rifle company? How about something less, 14 guys? Pretty good, but here's what I'm saying. I got 14 guys, I've got 3 fire teams and a command team. I can break into 4 small little tiny units. And that's part of my plan then, is to break in from here. The SEALs halt becomes the release point, and we look at ways of infiltrating 4 different teams, all towards our rendezvous point, right? And so we have to have, there we have a link up, and we've covered that, clandestine link up, we've covered that in another video. So we rendezvous here and link up, and from that point we then move on to something like maybe a hide position, but it's not going to be the same as the rendezvous point. In most cases it won't anyway. So then we all move over there. Now again, we may have to move back to the rendezvous point at different times if we've had any straggler teams that weren't able to rendezvous at the designated time and place. We might either set an alternate route rendezvous, or either way we've got to pick up those stragglers, move them to the hide position, knowing that our objective is over here, and then we're going to from here move and do actions on the objective. We'll know what we're doing here. We can talk about a raid, we can talk about markings and reconnaissance, we can talk about ambushes, we can talk about all those things, but that's not what infiltration and exfiltration is. Infiltration and exfiltration gets us to that point, right? So that's not my point to discuss that. Ultimately, that is our objective, though. This is how we conduct that infiltration. These are all the various moving parts. And again, why did we break into small units here? It's because 2 to 4 man teams are infinitely harder to detect. What did we say? We said we have to reduce our audio signature, so our movement, our sound. We have to detect our visual signature, so, you know, camouflage and using terrain and vegetation masking. We want to limit our thermal signature. Well, 2 people or 4 people offer inherently less thermal signature than 14. And so by breaking that up, the very first point here is that we are much less likely to be detected. Is it possible that we use the same exact route 4 times in a row? Dangerous, but possible. Here I've indicated that by 4 different routes. Now, the vulnerability is, wait, what if one of those are detected? Well, okay, then we might lose an asset, and that's a big problem for us. But the point is, by using 4 different routes, we only lose 1 of 4 assets. So we're down roughly a quarter. Either way, that's what we're doing. This is by stealth or by speed. The other way is that our rendezvous point, we could air assault into that, right? But again, now everybody knows we're here. So in this case, I'm showing how we achieve this through stealth. Lots of different variations about it, but again, it's getting past the enemy line into a rear area of the enemy so that we can carry out other objectives, other missions. That's the infiltration. Then what's the exfiltration? Again, we've already talked about what its purpose or its intent, and that is, of course, the recovery of friendly forces back to the safety of friendly forces. How do we do that? Well, this has to be carefully planned, but here are the 5 steps and or considerations that you're looking for. Step number 1 is enemy suppression plan. So that's the very first thing you were going to do, is suppress the enemy. Step 2, disseminate information to your own patrol. We'll get to it. Step 3, no surprise, escape and evade. Step 4 is the extraction method. And 5 is passage of lines. You're going to conduct a passage of lines. Enemy suppression plan. Whatever I'm doing, if the enemy knows that I'm there, let's say we conduct an ambush or a raid, or we are marking targets for drone attack and the enemy kind of figure out, hey, somebody's here. Maybe they find one of our markers, or maybe they're just smart guys and figure out, yeah, this isn't tapping alone, this is a little too accurate, it's a change in operations, right? Whatever the case is, if the enemy figures out, yep, we've got an enemy back here in our rear area, they're going to start looking for us. And so we now need to suppress them. And we can do that with artillery fires and close air support and all of those wonderful things, you think, but it's a little harder than we pretend. What if you don't even have those assets? There are other ways we can suppress the enemy. And one way to suppress them is to disrupt them. So how do you disrupt them? Well, distraction. Look over there and I run this way, right? Okay, that's a distraction and that's a disruption. It disrupts the enemy's efforts to find you long enough that you can make a clean getaway. Another way is if the enemy is, we just say, nah, we have a contingency plan that says if the enemy's hot on our heels, we will do a baited ambush. That is, we will make use of the enemy's concerted effort to chase us down and kill us off, and we'll turn that against them. We'll have them run into an ambush, and we'll execute an ambush on there. And whether it's a near ambush, a far ambush, it almost really doesn't matter, because our effort here isn't to kill all of the 10,000 enemy that are in this division, and we're in their, their rear area. I don't think my 14-man squad is going to be able to kill 10,000 enemy personnel. So there's no hope of killing them all. So why do a baited ambush? Why ambush at all? Well, the point here is, again, to disrupt them, to give them cause to slow down and say, whoa, I got to be more careful about this. I can't just keep running into, these guys are ambushing us, and I've got to figure out a way to outsmart and outmaneuver them. And that slows them down. 14 people travel much faster, on foot, one for one. 14 people travel much faster than 120. So we're being chased by bigger elements. We are a small element. And that brings a good point. Maybe we aren't. Maybe we don't remain together once we link up and, that 14-man. Maybe we break back into our smaller teams for exfiltration, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we break up and before we extract, once we pull off the objective, we not only need to suppress and or disrupt the enemy, we also need to come together to disseminate information. That has to happen as we pull off the objective. We have to share all the information either in an objective rally point, a hide position, or a patrol base. And the reason we do that is, of course, we've got valuable information that we want to get back to the friendly lines, that intelligence. And it has an expiration date. Furthermore, if only one fire team knows this, and that fire team is later compromised, killed, or captured, then the information didn't get back to friendly lines, and that's a problem too. So a dissemination of information, that's a critical point in planning your exfiltration. So make sure everybody gets the necessary information, okay? So step 3 then is escape and evade. Here what we're looking at is we're looking at terrain. We're the ACOCA acronym, right? Observation, covering concealment, obstacles, key terrain, and avenues of approach, right? So ACOCA. We're looking at how terrain helps us escape and evade. And again, terrain masking is what we're looking at, and vegetation masking as we escape and evade. And that escape and evade plan may very well say, okay, we remain together under these conditions, but under these conditions, and we use a contingency plan, and that is we break back into our smaller subunits to conduct the exfiltration. An extraction method, we do need to know how that's going to happen. Is it going to be by air vehicle, water vehicle, land vehicle? And if so, then we again need to look at terrain masking, because if we're being chased by the enemy, then we definitely want to make sure those vehicles aren't compromised and destroyed before they pick us up. We want to get away cleanly, right? But also, if the enemy is not chasing us at the point, we still want to keep as much elusiveness as possible until we jump onto that speed vehicle. And then finally you say, well, what if the extraction method is our good old boots? What if we're walking out? Well, that's a method, right? And so you need to know that. If that's the case, then passage of lines really becomes even more critical. Not to say that if you jump on a helicopter it's not important, trust me, but it's the air crew or the boat crew or the vehicle crew who knows, okay, I've already got a passage of lines system in place, and we use their re-entry process. If we're doing it on foot, nope, we need to re-enter, and so That's a whole nother class, as re-entry is a passage of line class, but of course what's critical about it is the far and near recognition signals. That is, how do good guys recognize you, a good guy, coming from the enemy terrain? Otherwise, they'll just light you up. They'll shoot you, destroy you. You don't want that. You want them to recognize while looking into hostile territory, hey, don't shoot us, we're good guys. Oh, all right, I recognize you, come on in. Those are your 5 things, again, of your exfiltration planning. Is you've got to do your enemy suppression plan, you've got to disseminate information, you've got to have your routes and methods of escape and evasion, you have to have your methods of extraction, even if that's just you walking out, and then you have to have passage of lines. How do you get back inside safety from the enemy territory? All of this requires rehearsal. It all requires rehearsal, okay? If you try to wing this, it's going to go disastrously. Just disastrously bad for you. And the other thing is operational security, OPSEC. Be very, very careful here. You have to share all of this information with your team, but make sure that you're not sharing it outside your team unless there's a need to know. And equally as important, make sure that you are not writing it down. Don't write down the most critical pieces of information, that if that person or that article is captured by the enemy, your entire mission is compromised. And that's a down and dirty overview of both the infiltration and exfiltration operations. All right, thank you.